The reading for today comes from the Gospel of Mark, and this is in chapter 8. This is 2 chapters from where we ended up last week. And this just continues on this road of discipleship between Jesus and his disciples. We're going to start at verse 27, and we're going to go through verse 38, that Mark 8, 27 through 38. So Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples answered him, "Oh, John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah, the Christ." And he sternly ordered them not to tell that to anyone. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man, or humankind, must undergo great sufferings and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Jesus said all of this quite openly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, but turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind," verbalizing, breathing, "not on the things of God, but on human things." And when he called the crowd with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone wants to follow me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake, and for the sake of the gospel, will save it. For what is it profit to them to gain the whole world and forfeit their soul? Or what can give in exchange for their soul? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father and the holy angels." May God bless and challenge us in the reading of this word. Thank you, choir. It's so beautiful. Are we thankful for that road, too? I mean, the words to that song, I can't help thinking, it just the gratitude, right, that we feel that whatever road we're on, all roads lead back to God. All roads lead back to God. It's that place of acceptance and the place of love, home. We forget that sometimes, I think. Sometimes I know. We get caught up in ourselves, don't we, in our stuff. Whatever that stuff is that makes us feel so very far from God's presence. They sang it in the song, "Feel alone, cried, afraid, tried, just powerless to get ourselves back there ourselves, but yet God's hand leads us back." Our desire to return to God's loving arms, like the prodigal son, with God running toward us with arms open, all of that stuff, when we're feeling so alone and so far away, that story seems like a fairy tale. Because the path to God's arms, from where we are, it can seem so overgrown and full of burrs and brambles and thorns, and how painful it's going to be to cut through all of that junk. So what do? We look for the path of least resistance, don't we? Gosh. With the least consequences, with the least complications, with the least conflagrations. How about that word? We want to be near God, but we want to keep ourselves safe. We don't want to get bit. We don't want to get bruised. We want peace, but we don't want to have to face the cross to get to peace. That's where Peter is in today's passage. Depending on the situation, sometimes Peter gets it. Sometimes Peter is just plain clueless. And many of us identify with Peter primarily for those reasons, whether it's his impulsiveness or his boldness, his doubtfulness, his failures. He is relatable to us because we've all been there. And it's wonderful. Because whatever the situation, whether Peter is flying or fumbling, Peter is always Peter. Maybe it's because he said, as he said, "We've left everything to follow you, Jesus." Maybe it's the loving acceptance he feels from Jesus, the freedom to be himself. He feels free enough with Jesus to speak whatever's on his mind. And you can tell him that maybe he's guilty of having no filter, but isn't that openness that we all want? And we could stop right there. We could ponder that for a lifetime, how we can grow close enough to Jesus to just speak our truth, our whole truth, nothing but the truth, with Jesus, without fear of being tossed out and condemned. Amen? Today's passage gives us a glimpse of what that looks like, that kind of relationship, that closeness. We've been talking for the last few weeks. The disciples have had a crash course in ministry. The Gospel of Mark, Jesus is not the patient teacher. After being sent out on their own, 2 by 2, they come back. We don't know what they faced. We don't know what condition they're coming back. Then they're thrown into the fire. Jesus tells them, "Go ahead, feed this crowd of 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Do it." Then they're in a storm. Jesus comes in a way that they don't even expect him to come. As an apparition, as a ghost. How dare he come in a way that we don't expect? I don't know. Chapter 7, Jesus tells a parable. A parable. The disciples ask him about the parable. You know what he does? He doesn't explain to them. He calls them dull. How can you be so dull? I don't know. Maybe it's life on the road that has Jesus so irritable, or maybe that's why in Mark, the disciples are often referred to as the disciples. Because maybe they're as thick as we are. Who knows? By the beginning of chapter 8 in Mark, once again, they're tasked with feeding a mass crowd. This time, not 5,000 people, this time 7,000 people. The movement is growing, obviously, just from the numbers. And we hope so are the disciples. So Jesus and the disciples, they get back on the road that day. They're ready for a good night's sleep at the motel right down a couple miles away. They're talking to pass the time on the road. Jesus asks the disciples, "How do you think it's going? Who do people say that I am?" It's a good question to ask ourselves all the time. Who do the people say Jesus is? What's the loudest voice in the room? And everybody chimes in with something. John the Baptist, Elijah, a prophet, a preacher, a magician, a storyteller, a charlatan, a hippie, a freak. Long pause. Everybody's looking at each other. "And who do you say that I am?" Jesus says. And good old Peter, the only one with the guts to come forward and just tell his opinion. "You are the Messiah. You are the Christ." Now, in other Gospels, Jesus' response to Peter's confession is something like, "Wow, Peter, right, you are blessed. You are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church." Not in Mark. When Peter says, "You are the Christ," to Jesus, Jesus says, "For crying out loud, don't tell people that." Why? Why? If the Messiah, who Jesus claimed to be and who actually was, why would he not want that news shared? Perhaps it's because Jesus knew that the disciples, like Peter, were still under a misconception of what Messiah meant and what Messiah actually looked like. And Jesus uses the moment to reveal it. The Messiah, the Christ, will undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, the chief priest, the scribes, and be killed, and after a couple of days, rise again. And from then on, Mark writes, Jesus said all of that quite openly. He told everybody. This was no metaphor. This was no parable. Jesus wasn't going to become a Caesar-like ruler. Jesus wasn't going to become a conqueror or a war hero. This would happen as Jesus said, suffering, rejection, killed, rise. So as they walk, Peter hears these words over and over, echoing in his mind, suffering, rejection, killed, rise. Suffering, rejection, killed, rise. And it clicks. Peter puts it all together. It wasn't just continuing to heal and preach. Oh, no. Jesus had much more, bigger plans than that. Jesus was teaching resistance of the systems of oppression. The religious leaders were already infuriated. The Roman government was already ticked off at him and had labeled him a noisemaker and a potential threat. Peter understood that when you add anti-government rhetoric to massive crowd appeal, it doesn't take long for you and those around you to get into serious trouble. And since Jesus wasn't building an army with that massive crowd appeal, understandably, Peter's concerned. And being Peter, he feels the need to say something to Jesus about it. So that night, after they've all checked into the Motel 6 and half the disciples go for a dip in the pool, the other ones go and look for change for vending machines, there's a knock at the door on Jesus' hotel room. Come on in, Pete. And Peter, hot and tired and visibly frustrated, hands his friend a cold one and says, "Can we talk for a couple minutes?" Sure. And they go out on the patio and watch the sunset together, and after a few sips, Jesus asks, "What's on your mind, buddy?" And Peter, trying to be his best diplomat, begins. "I didn't want to say anything in front of the other guys, but look, have you noticed what's happening lately? Have you seen that this thing that you started has gotten, a little bit out of hand? I mean, I know that we were into the whole preaching and teaching thing, and I was even okay when the healing started happening, and everybody else might have been freaking out, but I was okay with it. I was okay with the miracles. And then that fish and bread thing, great. Twice, great. I couldn't believe it. And then the storms that you calmed, it was fantastic. I'm not saying your intentions aren't good, Jesus, except, and let me just preface it by saying I'm fine with that God loves you just the way you are and that God loves everybody and the neighbor together. I'm good, but this new stuff, this other stuff, the talking and the acting against government stuff, the teaching people to resist the system stuff, buddy, it's too much. It's going too far. You have to knock it off, or you're going to get yourself killed. Get us killed. And where will that leave you? You can't do anything for people. You can't help people from 6 feet under. Who's going to make the bread and the loaves multiply then, Jesus? It's dangerous for all of us. Don't you understand that? So maybe just back off, just a little. Jesus doesn't flinch. He watches the sunset. Who's going to miss a good sunset? And without turning his head from that gorgeous purple and orange masterpiece of God, he whispers, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter's stunned. Of course he's stunned. I'd be stunned. Satan? Did he just call me Satan? I thought I was blessed. I thought I was a rock. Satan. Excuse me, Jesus, did you just call me Satan? And Jesus turns and looks Peter in the eye and said, "Let me say it so you can hear it. Get behind me, Satan." If you're going to be an opponent to this, if you're going to be Satan to this, then get out of my way. You sound like everybody else who thinks about safety and security. Don't make waves or you're going to get in trouble. You're slipping into that trap of fear. You're worried about the things of the world. You just comply with the injustice. God has more for us. God has more for God's people than oppression and fear. Now, I don't know how long it took Peter to digest those words. I don't know how long it takes us to digest those words. Because those are the words that we hear every day, if we listen. How long does it take to come to grips with the fact that following Jesus and the ways and teachings of Jesus means that it's going to come at a cost to us? How long before we come back to the table the next day and say, "Okay, I'm still in"? So the next morning at breakfast, they're all sitting in the lobby, and Jesus is spreading cream cheese on his bagel, and he gives a quick glance to Peter, who's sitting by himself brooding. He hasn't even touched his waffle. That's how upset he is. He's still upset from the night before. He hasn't done anything yet. So Jesus takes the opportunity to speak to the group. If any of you want to be my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. I wish the translators had come up with a better word than cross to translate this word, because remember, this is pre-resurrection. The cross, which means so much to us, does not mean that to the disciples. This is before we wore crosses as jewelry and have crosses up in every church. This is straight from the Greek dictionary I'm going to read to you. In Greek, the word is stauros, which is used for cross. This stauros could be of any size or shape, but it was specifically designed to display victims and keep them alive and in brutal agony for days. A stauros was not not only an instrument of execution, as is often supposed, but an instrument of deterrent. It was specifically designed not to kill people, because there were more efficient ways to do that, but to fill observers with fear and disgust and drain them from any further wish to rebel or revolt. Rome was a machine, a death-conquering machine. And it subdued the world in stages. After a nation's intellectual heart was liquidated and removed, the remaining masses were anesthetized. Listen here and see if you can have a similarity. Let me read this again. After a nation's intellectual heart was liquidated and removed, the remaining masses were anesthetized with entertainment and booze and luxury. The brave Roman historian Tacitus wrote contritely, because they didn't know better, they called it civilization, when it was just part of their enslavement. Does that make sense to you? Does it sound at all familiar to you? The resistance, I'll go on with the quote, the resistance nevertheless continued, and while some misguided zealots resorted to violence and were no better than the Romans themselves, the Roman population was largely so dumb that they couldn't even imagine anymore why anybody would want to oppose them, speak bad of them, or even subject them to terrorist attacks. Careful that we don't become so numb and dumb with luxury and entertainment that we miss the enslavement that comes with that. Step 2 of the enslavement, of course, of the conquering, was to flog half to death anything uppity, and nail what was left to anything vertical, hence the word stauros. Now, to the disciples, the cross was what happened to resistors. Simple. If you resist the government, if you resist Rome, you're going to end up stauros. A public display will be made of you. They understood that. So Jesus says to the disciples, take up your cross. And for the most part, we equate cross with what? Suffering, just plain suffering. We use it as an anchor. We use it as an excuse. When we have suffering in our lives, we have this problem or this situation that won't go away. We have an illness or something wrong with us, or a bad job or a bad living situation or something that we are stuck with, and we say, this is just my cross to bear, right? And I can understand the disciples having that interpretation, because to them the cross truly meant suffering. Except we have 2,000 years on them. We have 2,000 years of hindsight. And last time I checked, the cross to Christians was a symbol of resurrection. Jesus knew that the only way to salvation, to a life of equity and freedom and peace, was through resistance, was through non-violent non-compliance of the systems. And yeah, that brings suffering. Ask anyone in here who's done it. But it also means giving up a false reality, a numbed up and dumbed down reality. Numbing ourselves with booze and entertainment and luxury. And I know to the world it sounds wonderful. Anybody, any government, anybody who can promise us security, safety, riches, wealth, knowledge, oh my gosh, that's appealing. What cost does it come? We enjoy the benefits and fruits of our lives based on someone else losing blood. And creation is groaning. This is not what we're called to. You know how Jesus always was talking about we're called to be separate. We're called to be out of the world, not in it, not of it. We're in the world, not of it. Isn't that the saying? That's what this is. That's what we come here to sign up to do every week, to say, I heard it again. I understand the cost again. I understand it's going to lead to the cross again. And I'm still in. Most of us just want to finish our waffle first. It's a beautiful thing. We can look at it in a way that says, oh my gosh, I'm afraid to change the world. Or, oh my gosh, we have the power to change the world. And we need to reframe that continually for each other so that we don't succumb to fear, so that we don't get dumbed down, so that we don't get numbed up. We're here to be agents of peace, to change the world right now. We're going to sing For Such a Time as This, and lots of times we sang this during COVID, saying, oh, this is a really hard thing that we're getting through. This is great, and we're called here to be God's people for such a time as this, and we can still have a church, and we can still have a community. It can still be great. But this song is so much more. For such a time as this, it means that we step up. We step up despite the fear. We just step up actively, knowingly walking toward the cross, and we do it hand in hand with one another. May God bless you this morning.